This is the first of our 3 lectures on income inequality. So, why should we study income inequality? One of the central questions in labor economics is how income is distributed across workers and across households. Economists like to know, has inequality increased over time? And if so, how large is that increase? What forces in the labor market are responsible for these changes? A major turning point in the income inequality literature came with the work of Piketty and Sayers. I picked their 2003 article that kind of spawned a lot more that they did together. This article constructs long-run estimates of income inequality using tax records that go all the way back to 1913. This was really, really good data. And unsurprisingly, their findings became enormously influential in academic research and in public policy debates. However, there are some later works that argue that there are measurement issues in the tax data, and that may exaggerate their findings. So I've included in this lecture both Piketty and Sayers and an example of the opposite, Geloso and et al., a few other co-authors. Um, I think these are useful to read together because they show first a landmark empirical finding kind of sets up the research in the field for some time, and then a later reassessment of how those findings should be interpreted. All right, so let's dig in. First, how has the share of income going to top earners changed in the United States over the past century? It's a really big, zoomed out question. So instead of using the Gini coefficient as a simple measure of income inequality, the authors focus on the top 10% of income earners, the top 1% of income earners, and the top 0.1% of income earners. So we're focusing specifically on very high income individuals. So the key innovation of Piketty and Sayers is the use of historical tax return data. They compile income tax records from 1913. In the US, this is when modern federal income tax began, through the late 1990s. And this data allows them to measure the income share going to top earners over a very long period of time. When they were writing this back then, this kind of long-run inequality data set and like these consistent measures over a long period of time really didn't exist. Part of why this was so important. So their most famous finding is that inequality follows a U-shaped pattern over the 20th century. In the early 1900s, income inequality was extremely high. Large fortunes and capital income dominated the top of the income distribution. From the 30s to the 1970s, income inequality fell drastically. There are a lot of possible explanations given for this, things like progressive taxation, strong unions at the time, rapid economic growth, and the compression of wages during and after World War II. But beginning around the 1980s, this this trend changed, and income inequality, excuse me, sharply rose again. The share of income going to the top 1% roughly doubles over this time period. And this finding became one of those widely cited results in modern economics. Another important finding is that the type of income at the top changed over time. So going back to the days before World War II, top incomes were dominated by capital income. So things like dividends, rents, and interest were how the richest in the US made their money. But in recent decades, that's changed, and much of the rise in the top income comes from labor income, especially from executives, finance professionals, and highly paid managers. So this led to large literature on the top earners and executive compensation, really examining the causes of those changes and the effects of those changes and how the top earned their money. So this paper changed the field in several ways. First, it introduced a new data set based on tax records. This was huge. Second, it shifted attention towards top income shares rather than broader measures of inequality like the Gini coefficient. Third, it helped shape policy debates around tax policy, executive compensation, globalization, technology and skill premiums, probably a lot of other things that I could list. And the data set created by Piketty and Sayers later became part of the World Inequality Database, which is widely used by researchers. So even people that aren't directly using their data and citing them are still relying upon the work that they built. So did inequality rise as much as the tax data suggests? Or could some of the measured increase be caused by changes in how income is recorded and reported? So Geloso, Magnus, Moore, and Schlosser argue that we have to be careful because tax data aren't a perfect measure of economic income. And they identified several factors that can affect measured inequality. So the first is changes in tax law. Tax reforms that occur over time can change how people report income. So, for example, if tax rates fall, high income individuals may have less incentive to hide income or to shift it into corporations or shift it into other forms that are taxed at a lower rate. So, this can make inequality appear to increase in tax data, even if the underlying incomes didn't really change that much. If the richest people are still pulling in as much money, they're just classifying it differently. The second is income definition problems. So tax data do not capture all income equally. Some types of income may appear in corporate accounts and retirement accounts or untaxed benefits. And if these aren't included consistently over time, it can distort inequality estimates and show changes occurring where they're really not occurring. And third, and finally, we have the denominator problem. The top income shares depend on both income of the top group and the total income of the economy. If the measure of total income is incomplete, the top share will appear artificially high. And here the authors argue that using national income accounts to adjust the denominator changes the results of Piketty and Sayers. And after adjusting for these issues, the rise in the top income shares since the 1980s still exists, but it's smaller than originally estimated by Piketty and Sayers. So Benson-Geloso and his co-authors argue that it's not that inequality didn't rise, but what they argue is that the magnitude of the increase was overstated and that it's not as bad or not as extreme as it appeared to be in 2003 looking at the data. So the debate here, I tried to highlight two papers, one from each camp in this debate, is this can highlight a key lesson in empirical economics. So kind of pulling back away from income inequality specifically, we see that measurement matters. That different choices about data sources, income definitions, and statistical adjustments that we make can produce very different conclusions about economic trends. And these can impact any empirical work. But they have the most striking effect when we're looking at long-run trends like income inequality over almost 100 years. So understanding income inequality and changes over time requires good data and careful measurement.